January 26th, 1945. The woods near Holtzwihr, France. A thin layer of ice covers the ground, and morning fog clings to the tree line like funeral shroud. First Lieutenant Audie Murphy stands alone on the deck of a burning M10 tank destroyer, surrounded by 6 German Panzer tanks and 250 advancing Wehrmacht infantry. The vehicle beneath his feet is consuming itself in flames. Ammunition inside could detonate at any moment. He should be running. He should be dead. Instead, he grips the handles of an M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun and begins to fire. What happens next will become the stuff of legend. But this moment represents something far greater than one man's extraordinary courage. This is the story of a weapon that changed the calculus of warfare. A machine gun so devastating, so utterly reliable, so psychologically crushing that it broke the will of the most disciplined army the world had ever seen. This is the story of why German soldiers learned to fear a sound more than death itself, the deep, methodical thunder of the American 50 caliber. To understand what happened that frozen morning in Holtzwihr, and to understand why German forces developed an almost supernatural dread of the M2 Browning, we must first understand what made this weapon different from everything that came before it. The year is 1918. The First World War is staggering toward its bloody conclusion. An American firearms designer named John Moses Browning presents the United States Army with a new heavy machine gun. It fires a cartridge of unprecedented power, the 50 caliber BMG, standing for Browning machine gun. The round is massive, nearly 5.5 inches long, capable of delivering devastating kinetic energy at ranges exceeding a mile. But the war ends before the gun can see action, and the design sits, waiting, being refined, being perfected. By the time the Second World War erupts across Europe in September of 1939, John Browning is dead, but his creation has evolved into something remarkable. The M2 Browning has become more than a weapon. It has become a philosophy made manifest in steel. Where other nations design machine guns for specific roles, infantry support, vehicle defense, anti-aircraft work, the Americans created a universal tool of violence. The M2 could do everything. It could shred aircraft at altitude. It could penetrate light armor. It could suppress infantry at impossible distances. It could fire continuously for hours without failure. And perhaps most importantly, it could be mounted on anything. This last point cannot be overstated. American military doctrine in World War II was built on a foundation of mechanization and mobility. While the Wehrmacht relied heavily on horses, hundreds of thousands of them, to move supplies and artillery, the American military was almost entirely motorized. And the doctrine was simple, almost brutally so. Every vehicle that could physically support a 50 caliber machine gun would have one. Jeeps, half-tracks, trucks, tanks, tank destroyers, armored cars, self-propelled artillery, even ambulances in some cases. The result was that every American unit, even rear echelon support companies, possessed overwhelming mobile firepower. German soldiers who survived encounters with American forces consistently reported the same observation in after-action reports and prisoner interrogations. They were not simply fighting enemy infantry. They were fighting an entire mechanized army that could bring devastating fire to bear from multiple angles simultaneously. A single American platoon, with its attached vehicles, could deliver more sustained firepower than a German company. The psychological effect was profound. German infantry, some of the finest trained soldiers in military history, found themselves outgunned by what they considered support troops. But the fear, the real, visceral fear that German soldiers developed, did not begin on the ground. It began in the sky. Picture yourself as a Luftwaffe fighter pilot in the summer of 1943. You have survived the brutal Eastern Front. You have flown through Soviet anti-aircraft fire that turned the sky black with explosions. You have engaged enemy fighters in desperate dogfights where a single mistake meant death. You are not easily frightened. You are Jagdflieger, a hunter of the air. And then you receive your orders. You are being transferred west. You will now intercept American bomber formations over the Reich itself. The briefings are straightforward. The Americans fly in tight formations for mutual protection. Their bombers, the B-17 Flying Fortress, are heavily armed but slow. Your Focke-Wulf or Messerschmitt is faster, more maneuverable. You have cannon. You have the advantage. At least this is what they tell you. Then you see your first formation. They come in waves, hundreds of bombers arranged in a combat box formation that looks like a moving fortress made of aluminum and rage. Each B-17 carries 13 machine guns. Most are 50 calibers. You do the mathematics in your head, though you wish you hadn't. A standard combat box of 18 bombers means 234 machine guns, all waiting for you to come within range. And the range of the 50 cal is extraordinary. Over 1,000 yards effective range in aerial combat. Longer if the gunner is skilled. You make your attack run from the front, the angle they told you was safest, approaching at a combined closing speed of over 500 miles per hour. You have perhaps 3 seconds to aim and fire before you must break away or collide with the bomber formation. But in those 3 seconds, you enter what pilots will later call the wall of steel. Dozens of 50 caliber machine guns track your approach. The streams of fire converge. The rounds are larger than your thumb. Each one carries the kinetic energy of a small artillery shell. A single hit can remove a wing. 2 hits can cut your fighter in half. The tracer rounds create visible lanes of death. The sky becomes a geometric nightmare of intersecting fire. If you are lucky, you fire your cannon and break away untouched. If you are skilled and lucky, you see your rounds strike home, pieces of the bomber tearing away in your wake. But if you are typical, if you are simply one more good pilot doing your duty, the 50 caliber rounds find you first. They punch through your engine cowling and your engine seizes, thick black smoke pouring from the cylinders. They shred your control surfaces and your aircraft becomes uncontrollable. They penetrate your cockpit and you die instantly. Or worse, you die slowly as you fall, unable to bail out, watching the earth rise to meet you. Luftwaffe pilots who flew against American formations in 1943 and 1944 suffered catastrophic casualties. Entire fighter wings were destroyed. Experienced pilots, men who had survived hundreds of combat missions, were killed or crippled. The veterans who survived developed a grim respect for the 50 caliber. It was not just a weapon, it was an industrial process. The Americans did not fight with skill alone. They fought with quantity and quality combined. They fought with an endless supply of ammunition and spare barrels. They fought with machines that did not tire and did not miss as often as human reflexes should allow. In the debriefings, in the letters home that would pass through military censors, in the quiet conversations between pilots who had seen too much, a common theme emerged: the sound. The 50 caliber did not sound like other machine guns. It had a deeper voice, a slower rate of fire that was paradoxically more menacing. Where German machine guns screamed, the American 50 caliber spoke with authority. Each round announced itself. And in the air, when dozens of them fired simultaneously, the sound was like thunder that never ended. When American forces landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, German defenders faced an enemy unlike any they had encountered before. The Wehrmacht had fought the British and Commonwealth forces for years. They understood British tactics, British weapons, British doctrine. The Americans were different. The Americans brought machines. Within weeks of the Normandy landings, German commanders were submitting reports that revealed a disturbing pattern. American infantry advances were almost always preceded by overwhelming fire support. Artillery, yes, but also something more immediate, more personal. The 50 caliber machine guns mounted on American vehicles created a suppressive fire environment so intense that German infantry could not effectively return fire. Positions that should have been defensible became death traps. Cover that should have been adequate proved insufficient. The rounds themselves were the problem. A standard rifle bullet, even a machine gun bullet of smaller caliber, could be stopped by sandbags, by brick walls, by earthen berms, by the structural elements of buildings. The 50 caliber round treated these obstacles with contempt. Sandbags burst apart, showering defenders with sand and fragments of burlap. Brick walls developed holes that grew larger with each impact until entire sections collapsed. Wooden beams splintered and shattered. Even concrete, depending on thickness and quality, could be penetrated. This meant that German infantry could no longer rely on the defensive tactics that had served them so well against other opponents. The concept of cover versus concealment became meaningless when the enemy's primary support weapon could shoot through both. Soldiers who had learned to survive by understanding the limits of enemy firepower now faced a weapon with seemingly no limits at all. And the Americans mounted these weapons everywhere. Jeeps carried them on pintles that allowed 360 degrees of rotation. Half-tracks mounting quad 50 calibers, 4 of the guns synchronized on a single mounting, could fire 1,900 rounds per minute combined. The effect on infantry caught in the open was not combat, it was execution. German after-action reports described entire squads being annihilated in seconds. Bodies were found with wounds that defied medical description. Limbs separated from torsos. Torsos bisected by multiple impacts. Heads that simply ceased to exist. The German Medical Corps, renowned for their skill and organization, began to recognize 50 caliber wounds as a distinct category of trauma. These were not bullet wounds in any conventional sense. These were massive tissue destruction events. The rounds created temporary wound cavities. The expanded space caused by the bullet's shock wave, larger than a man's fist. Bones did not fracture, they exploded into fragments. Blood vessels were not punctured, they were erased. Soldiers who survived direct hits to extremities almost always required immediate amputation. There was simply nothing left to save. Medics and surgeons working near the front lines developed a grim shorthand. They could identify 50 caliber casualties before examining the wounds simply by the amount of blood. A single 50 caliber hit produced more hemorrhaging than multiple rifle caliber wounds. Soldiers hit in the torso rarely lived long enough to reach aid stations. Those hit in the limbs could sometimes be saved, but they would never fight again. Never work again in any capacity that required the use of that limb. They would return to Germany if they returned at all, as living reminders of American firepower. The psychological impact of witnessing these wounds cannot be measured statistically, but it appears throughout captured documents and prisoner testimony. German soldiers were not strangers to violence. They had fought on the Eastern Front, where combat reached levels of brutality that surpassed anything in the West. But the Eastern Front was rifle fire and artillery, knife fights in trenches, the brutal intimacy of close combat. The 50 caliber was something else. It was industrial. It was impersonal. It was the mechanical application of overwhelming force. And it was everywhere. American armored doctrine compounded the problem for German forces. Every American tank, from the light Stuart to the medium Sherman to the heavy Pershing, carried at least one 50 caliber machine gun. Most Shermans carried 2, one mounted coaxially with the main gun, another on a pintle mount at the commander's position. Tank destroyers like the M10 and M36 carried them. Self-propelled artillery pieces carried them. Armored cars carried them. The Americans had essentially decided that the 50 caliber was as essential to armored warfare as the main gun itself. This created a tactical problem for German forces that had no good solution. Traditional anti-tank tactics relied on infantry getting close enough to use Panzerfaust rockets or magnetic mines. But approaching an American tank meant crossing ground swept by 50 caliber fire. The machine gun's range exceeded that of any infantry anti-tank weapon by hundreds of yards. German infantry had to somehow survive crossing that kill zone, survive the tank's main gun, survive supporting American infantry, and still retain enough cohesion to actually engage the target. In practice, this rarely happened. American tank crews developed aggressive tactics that exploited this advantage. Rather than waiting for infantry support, tanks would advance with the 50 caliber firing continuously, hosing down suspected enemy positions with sustained bursts. The psychological effect was devastating. German infantry, trained to hold their ground and wait for the optimal moment to engage, found themselves pinned by fire so intense that lifting one's head above cover meant death. By the time the tank closed to within Panzerfaust range, the defenders were often suppressed, disorganized, or dead. German commanders attempted to counter this with revised tactics. They positioned anti-tank guns at greater distances, hoping to engage American armor before the 50 calibers could suppress their crews. But American doctrine had an answer for this as well. Combined arms. Artillery and air support would target known or suspected anti-tank positions. American infantry would advance under the covering fire of the 50 calibers, clearing positions. And the sheer number of American vehicles meant that even when German anti-tank guns scored kills, more vehicles were always coming. The numbers tell the story with cold clarity. By late 1944, the average American armored division possessed over 250 caliber machine guns, a single division. The Wehrmacht, fighting on multiple fronts with increasingly strained logistics, could not match this concentration of heavy firepower. German units reported feeling not outnumbered, but outgunned to a degree that rendered tactical skill nearly irrelevant. You could be the finest infantry in the world, and it would not matter if the enemy could simply saturate your position with 50 caliber fire until nothing remained. If German soldiers on the ground feared the 50 caliber, German soldiers anywhere near roads, rail lines, or supply routes lived in absolute terror of clear skies. The Americans had mounted 8 M2 Brownings on a single-engine fighter called the P-47 Thunderbolt, 8 50 caliber machine guns with a combined rate of fire of approximately 4,000 rounds per minute. When a P-47 dove on a target and opened fire, it did not engage in combat, it erased things. The Thunderbolt pilots called it Jabo, short for Jag bomber, the German term for fighter bomber that the Americans adopted. The Germans called it other things, names that suggested both respect and dread. The Thunderbolt was not elegant like the British Spitfire or nimble like the German Focke-Wulf. It was heavy, brutish, and intimidating. It looked like a radial engine with wings, a flying juggernaut, and it was perfect for ground attack. A typical Jabo mission would begin with the P-47 patrol finding a target of opportunity, a convoy, a train, a column of troops, a concentration of vehicles. The pilot would roll into a dive, building speed, lining up the target in his gun sight. At a predetermined altitude, usually around 1,500 feet to avoid ground fire, he would press the trigger. 8 50 caliber machine guns would fire in unison. The sound heard from the ground was like the sky tearing apart. The effect on the target was catastrophic. Vehicles did not simply take damage. They disintegrated. Trucks burst into flames as fuel tanks ruptured. The heavy rounds punched through thin vehicle armor as if it did not exist. Trains were particularly vulnerable. The locomotive was a large, stationary target, and once disabled, the entire train became a shooting gallery. German engineers learned to avoid running trains during daylight hours in contested areas. The risk was simply too great. But the truly horrific aspect of Jabo attacks was what happened to personnel. Soldiers caught in the open during a strafing run had virtually no chance of survival. The concentration of fire from 8 machine guns created a beaten zone, the area where rounds impacted, that was measured in thousands of square feet. Everything in that zone was shredded. Human bodies, animals, equipment, the earth itself. Survivors reported that the ground erupted in fountains of dirt and debris, that the air filled with fragments of metal and stone, that the noise was so overwhelming it caused physical pain. German forces attempted various countermeasures, increased anti-aircraft protection for convoys, movement only during hours of darkness or poor weather, dispersion of forces to present fewer concentrated targets. All of these measures helped, but none eliminated the threat. The Americans simply had too many aircraft, too much ammunition, too much aerial supremacy. By the winter of 1944, German movement during daylight hours in areas where Allied aircraft operated had been reduced to brief, desperate sprints between covered positions. The psychological toll was severe. German soldiers developed what modern psychologists would recognize as hypervigilance. The sound of aircraft engines produced immediate stress responses, elevated heart rate, rapid breathing, the overwhelming urge to find cover even when cover was not needed. Veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had endured Stalingrad and Kursk, reported that they feared American air attack more than Soviet artillery. At least artillery could be predicted. At least you could hear the shells coming. The Jabo seemed to appear from nowhere, and when it struck, death was instant and random. Let us return now to where we began. January 26, 1945. Holtzwihr, France. First Lieutenant Audie Murphy is standing on a burning tank destroyer. He is 20 years old. He weighs 140 pounds. Before the war, He was a sharecropper's son from Texas who hunted rabbits to feed his family. Now he is a company commander, decorated multiple times, a veteran of campaigns in Sicily, Italy, and France. And he is surrounded by an entire German battalion. The attack began with artillery. Then the tanks came. Then the infantry, moving in that organized, professional manner that marked Wehrmacht tactical doctrine. Murphy's company was understrength, depleted by previous fighting. When the assault began, he ordered his men to fall back to defensive positions in the woods. But someone had to slow the German advance. Someone had to buy time. The M10 tank destroyer had taken a hit and was burning. Its crew had already evacuated. But its M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun was intact. Murphy climbed onto the vehicle, took hold of the gun, and began to fire. For the next hour, he would stand exposed, flames rising around him, and single-handedly break a German assault. The 50 caliber in Murphy's hands became an instrument of precision destruction. He could see the German infantry advancing in squad rushes, using proper fire and movement tactics. He engaged them methodically. Short bursts, disciplined fire, conserving ammunition. The heavy rounds found targets at ranges where rifle fire would have been ineffective. German soldiers fell, others sought cover. Officers tried to organize a flanking attack. Murphy shifted his fire, suppressed the flanking element. The German tanks were advancing, but their infantry support was faltering. This is the crucial detail that explains why the 50 caliber was so devastating. It was not simply about the power of each round, though that was significant. It was about sustained, accurate fire at ranges that other weapons could not match. Murphy was not spraying bullets wildly. He was applying precise violence at distance, and the Germans could not effectively respond. Their rifles could not reach him. Their machine guns were being repositioned under fire. Their tanks could not depress their guns enough to hit him without closing to point-blank range. And the burning tank destroyer made an approach dangerous for armored vehicles worried about ammunition explosions. For an hour, Murphy stood and fired. The telephone line connecting him to the artillery fire direction center remained intact. Between bursts from the 50 caliber, he called in artillery strikes on German positions, directing fire with the calm precision of a man who had done this too many times before. The combination of the 50 caliber suppressing German infantry and artillery, destroying German concentrations, broke the attack. When Murphy's ammunition was finally exhausted, the German force had taken approximately 50 casualties from his fire alone. The assault had stalled. His company's position had held. Murphy would receive the Medal of Honor for this action. But the real story is not about individual heroism, though Murphy's courage was undeniable. The real story is about what one properly employed 50 caliber machine gun in the hands of a trained soldier could accomplish against a numerically superior force. This was the weapon's true terror. It made skill and courage and determination almost irrelevant. It made the battlefield a place where American firepower could overcome German tactical superiority. In the final months of the war, as German forces retreated toward the Reich itself, the 50 caliber's dominance became absolute. American forces had refined their doctrine to the point where the weapon was integrated into every level of combat operations. Infantry platoons expected 50 caliber support from attached vehicles. Armor units led advances with machine guns firing. Air assets strafed anything that moved. The Germans were not simply being defeated. They were being systematically destroyed by a weapon system they could not counter. German prisoner interrogations from this period reveal a force that had lost faith not in their own abilities, but in the possibility of victory against such material superiority. Captured soldiers spoke of feeling helpless, of watching American tracers at night and knowing that behind each visible round were 4 more that could not be seen, of hearing the deep hammer of the 50 caliber and understanding that death was being distributed with industrial efficiency, of seeing veterans, hard men who had survived years of combat, flinch at the sound. The Americans understood what they had created. The M2 Browning was more than a weapon system. It was a psychological warfare tool. The sound of a 50 caliber firing created panic in enemy forces. The sight of tracer fire at night created despair. The knowledge that American forces could bring this weapon to bear in any engagement, at any time, created a sense of inevitable defeat. German tactical skill could win battles, but American firepower was winning the war. What made this especially crushing for German forces was that they understood weapon design. They respected engineering excellence. They had created some of the finest small arms in military history. The MG-42 machine gun, the STG-44 assault rifle, weapons that would influence firearms design for decades. But they had nothing that could match the 50 caliber's combination of power, range, reliability, and versatility. The MG-42 was an excellent infantry support weapon, but it fired a standard rifle cartridge. It could not penetrate vehicle armor. It could not reach out to the distances the 50 caliber could dominate. It was a different class of weapon. German attempts to develop a comparable heavy machine gun came too late and in too few numbers to matter. The 13.2 millimeter MG-131 was designed for aircraft use and was never effectively deployed in a ground role. The 15 millimeter MG-151 existed in limited numbers and was primarily an anti-aircraft weapon. By the time German industry might have produced a true 50 caliber equivalent, the factories were being bombed into rubble by aircraft armed with the very weapons Germany needed to counter. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. The M2 Browning had been in production since 1921. It would remain in production for the next century. When this script is being recorded, the M2 is still in frontline service with the United States military and dozens of allied nations. It has fought in every American conflict from World War II through Afghanistan. It has served in infantry, armor, aviation, and naval roles. It has been mounted on helicopters, boats, trucks, and fighting vehicles of every description. It is, quite possibly, the most successful machine gun design in human history, but its legacy is not simply about longevity. The M2 Browning changed how militaries thought about firepower. It demonstrated that a single weapon system, properly employed and produced in sufficient quantities, could create battlefield dominance that transcended tactics. The Germans learned this lesson at terrible cost. Their soldiers, among the finest trained and most tactically proficient in history, were systematically defeated by an enemy that brought overwhelming material superiority to bear. The veterans who returned to Germany after the war carried memories of the 50 caliber with them. In the decades that followed, when they spoke of their experiences, and many did not speak of them at all, the weapon appeared again and again in their accounts. The sound, the power, the hopelessness of facing it. Some described it with a kind of grudging respect, others with undisguised terror. But all of them remembered. The American military learned different lessons. They learned that investment in superior weapons technology, combined with the industrial capacity to produce those weapons in overwhelming numbers, could substitute for larger standing armies. They learned that mobility and firepower could defeat even the most skilled infantry forces. They learned that the right weapon, in sufficient quantity, could break enemy morale as effectively as any propaganda campaign. These lessons would shape American military doctrine for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. But perhaps the most important legacy of the 50 caliber in World War II is what it revealed about modern warfare itself. The battlefield had become a place where individual courage and unit cohesion, while still necessary, were no longer sufficient for victory. The side with superior technology and greater industrial capacity possessed an advantage that skill alone could not overcome. The M2 Browning was an expression of this new reality. It was a weapon that said, in the most direct way possible, that America would win through overwhelming force applied with mechanical precision. On that frozen morning in January 1945, when Audie Murphy stood on that burning tank destroyer and held back an entire German battalion, he was not simply performing an act of individual heroism. He was demonstrating the culmination of American military philosophy. One soldier with the right weapon and sufficient ammunition could accomplish what entire companies could not. The Germans who survived that engagement would remember the sound of that 50 caliber for the rest of their lives. It was the sound of their defeat. It was the sound of modern war. It was the sound that announced the future had arrived, and it spoke with the deep, methodical thunder of American industrial might made manifest in steel. The M2 Browning did not win World War II alone. No weapon ever could, but it was the weapon that German soldiers feared above all others. It was the weapon that came to symbolize American military power. It was the weapon that taught the Wehrmacht that courage and skill were not enough. And it remains 8 decades later, still in service, still effective, still teaching the same brutal lessons to those who face it. Some designs are merely good, some designs are revolutionary, and some designs, like the M2 Browning, transcend their original purpose to become something more. A piece of history that refuses to become history, a weapon that defines what a weapon can be. The Germans did not simply hate the American 50 caliber, they feared it, they respected it, they had no answer for it, and in the end, that made all the difference.